Hey everybody, Todd Seymour here, and today we're going to talk about how a revocable living trust works. And we talked about it before. A lot of people just call them trusts. So for this video, we're just going to call it a trust. So how does a trust work? So, we talked before about pros and cons of trusts, and today I thought I'd give you a few basic examples on how these things even work and what you need to do. So before you do that, there's a few things that you need to think about and some terminology that may help you out a little bit. So there's something called a grantor of a trust. And a grantor is just the person that created the trust. Pretty simple. You don't really hear it too much, but a grantor creates the trust. So we're going to keep using me for an example. It's the Todd Seymour Trust. I'm the grantor. And usually you're also the trustee. And the person who's the trustee, they run the trust. And then the third important part is the beneficiary. And that's who gets the money. And so those three things will kind of help us out when we're talking about all these different terminologies, and that you hear it sometimes. And again, the more you know, I think the more it makes you feel comfortable. So I have this trust here, this revocable living trust. I'm the grantor, so I created that trust. I'm going to run that trust. In other words, I'm going to say what goes in it and all those kind of things. And that's the trustee. They're the ones that are in charge, basically. And then the beneficiary is who gets the money. So if I created my own, Todd Seymour Trust, I would be all three of these, right? So I created that trust. I'm also the trustee because I'm going to run that trust. And I'm also the beneficiary right now while I'm alive because I'm going to get that money. And so these things all change as life events change. The grantor never changes. So let me just put that so the grantor never changes in a trust, because the person that creates the trust, even if they die, they're still the grantor. The trustee can change at death or incapacity. And by incapacity, I mean, God forbid you get into a car accident and are on life support, you get Alzheimer's, those types of things. The trustee can change, and the beneficiary can change sometimes daily. So all joking aside, we have clients that sometimes will change all the time. I'm upset at my child because they haven't called, so take him out of the trust. Oh, no, they called, put him back in. So that's the main reason why a lot of times clients change their trust. But beneficiaries can change all the time. So it depends on, if kids get into trouble and things like that. So that's the grantor is the person that creates it. So even if they passed away, they're still basically the ones that created it. That doesn't change. Trustees change usually upon death, and we'll talk about that more in another example. And then a beneficiary is obviously the one that gets the money, and usually that's the biggest reason why people change trusts. What's the most important person out of those three? It depends who you are, but if you have created this trust, the trustee is by far the most important. And the reason is because they're your CEO, and they're the ones that are most responsible for all the important decisions. They pay the bills. And so I tell people a lot of times is think about a trust like a business. So right now you use your own social security number, and all your investments and so forth go into this. So let's talk about this. This is called funding. And this is the biggest misconception that people have. And where I've seen the biggest mistakes is about how do I set this trust up, I created it, I finally made all my decisions about who the grantor was, who the trustee was, who the beneficiary was. Now I got to figure out, that's awesome. Now I'll give you a quick story. One of my, I worked at estate planning firms for many, many years and went to an investment firm, and my very first day, I sit down with one of the biggest clients I've ever seen monetarily, and they bring in all their trust documents and everything, and super proud that they set all this stuff up about 10 years ago. And, he had a house, actually he had 3 houses, and he had investments, and he had cars, and he had bank accounts, and he had all other types of investments. But all of that was never funded into his trust. And so if he passed away, he still personally owned those assets, not the trust. And so what happened if he would have passed away, if you personally owned it without beneficiaries, which is very common, by the way, I see it all the time, it goes through what? Probate. And so here is this client, and it's not just one, we've had many over the years, who spend all the time setting it up as grantor, establishing the trustee, establishing the beneficiaries, thinking they have a legacy plan. They have this document, and trusts are worthless unless they're funded. And so let's talk about, what does funding mean? So I own my primary home. Let's just take that for example. And it's owned, again, by me, Todd Seymour, personally. But I created this trust. And that, when you read the document, says Todd Seymour, trustee of the Todd Seymour Trust. So when you own that personally, we need to change the owner on accounts to the trust. And so basically what you're doing is you're taking things out of your personal name and putting it into the trust to avoid probate. Because once I put it into the trust, now I funded the trust, that's called funding, then now I've got a grantor, a trustee, and a beneficiary that own that home. And if I have an investment account or a bank account, and we'll talk about some of these later, but mostly it's this investment account. What if I put that investment account, that's a non-retirement account, let me make that specific too. If we put that into my trust and I pass away, well, it has a beneficiary automatically, so it avoids probate. And so we talk about, again, working on all this and making sure we understand it. So today we're just trying to make sure we understand how the trust works. And my next video, maybe we'll talk about how it works after you pass away. But we first got to figure out, how do I set it up? Okay, well, I'm going to name myself as a grantor and a trustee. When I pass away, who's going to be my beneficiary? How are they going to get that money? We talked about this before too, is that it's amazing with a trust is that we can technically set up all different kinds of ways. If I have kids that are minors, we can set up retirement accounts for them when they start working. We can do all kinds of creative planning with a trust, because the trust, the beauty of a trust is that once I pass away, it goes out of my social security number and into its own tax ID number. And that's why it avoids probate. So the minute I pass away, from going from Todd Seymour trustee, it'll go to the new trustee, whoever that may be. And since the grantor, me, has passed away, it gets its own tax ID number and just keeps running. So again, it's like a business. Now there's a new CEO. That CEO is paying bills and handling investments and making distributions to beneficiaries. And it just keeps going and going and going until the trust says that it needs to be liquidated. And at that time, then money has to come back out to dissolve it. And so hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight. It's not as confusing sometimes as it sounds. I always tell clients to take a step back and say, just think of your estate plan like a business. Okay, you have investments. A business owns assets. It pays bills. It makes distributions to employees. So this is making distributions to beneficiaries or even to the trustees. And it just basically operates like a business. When you pass away, it gets its own tax ID number. It files its own tax returns, and it just keeps running until the trust says to fully liquidate. And then that's it. The biggest part that I wanted you to get out of this is that while you've created this document, you have to make sure, because many attorneys don't fund, they just create the trust. It's up to you a lot of times to retitle the assets into the trust so that the trust owns it. So if you have any questions, follow-ups, I'd love to hear them as usual. We get some great feedback, and that also helps us create new videos. And you can reach us always at taxandtrusthelp@gmail.com. Thanks so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.